Hi, I'm Brian LaGuardia, and I've really been enjoying the score to the Rings of Power. I've been a huge fan of Bears ever since Kobol's Last Gleaming, which was the Season 1 finale of his Battlestar score way back in 2005. So I've followed his career with great interest since then. I even got to meet him a couple times and even do an assignment for him at USC, which was a lot of fun. But as soon as I heard that he was scoring Rings of Power, I knew it was going to be amazing, and sure enough, it was. So much so that I decided to mock up one of my favorite cues from that first season so far. So I've got it up here. Let's take a listen, and then we'll talk about it. Can we, before we dive into this, can we just take a moment to appreciate the writing here? Because this melody is just perfect. It's got the sophistication to keep you interested, but it also has the simplicity to get stuck in your head. I mean, I was whistling this melody for days after I heard the initial cue. God, so good. Okay, so I thought I'd do a little walkthrough on my mock-up here. Let's start with the strings. They're just kind of sustaining here in the beginning, and I have them separated out into sections. But then when we get here, and they go lower and start to follow the voice leading of the choir, I definitely switch over to the ensemble articulation patch. This is Cinestrings, by the way. I bought it 7-8 years ago with the student discount and haven't really looked back since. I just adore the sound of this library. I mean, listen, especially when the ensemble legato patch goes, listen to how full and lush this sound is, and amazing low end too. It's just, it sounds like, it sounds so cinematic. You know, it sounds like it was recorded at Fox or Sony or something, which it is. It was recorded at one of those, I think. Anyways, as far as CC automation, of course, I put a little curve on the mod wheel, which is always a good idea to do anyways, even if it's theoretically just kind of a sustain with no dynamic markings. I suspect that that during the recording session, there were actually hairpins here, just because the effect is so pronounced. Even if not, though, a musician is trained to not play statically. They're trained to give it some shape, right? So even if this was, you know, 2 footballs or whole notes with a tie and no dynamic information other than where to start, the player is still probably going to go instead of you know, that's not how they play. But in this case, it was so exaggerated in the bass track that I really gave it some nice shape, and it sounds pretty good. There's no brass in the beginning. Ah, yes, the Percussion Groove. So on Bear's blog, he said he was using frame drums. That's what I did here. You'll notice there are different notes being played here. Those correspond to different attacks on the drum itself, different techniques for striking it, which basically lines up to what we're hearing. There was a tambourine there too, pretty sparse, pretty low in the mix as well. Made sure that was in there. This, however, is a bit of a deviation for a number of reasons. And before I go into them, let me show you what I did. So this is the Drums of War patch, all hits. Drums of War 1, not 2. And the reason why I used this was twofold. One was that I think I remember reading somewhere on the Cinesamples page that one of the people who worked on this also worked on a lot of the non-traditional drum percussion in the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, so that was a nice connection. More importantly, though, it definitely it just adds that extra oomph that was missing with just a frame drum, and it wasn't. It's maybe a little more than what was in the bass track, but I'd rather go a little bit too far that way than too far the other way, where it's just too thin and it's not very satisfying. You know what I mean? Because you don't really hear the frame drum slap except for the end of the phrase towards the end of the bar, right here, which is where I have it. But also, once we get here into the second half of the track and things really fill out and everyone's going crazy at the 2D section, it cuts through the mix a lot better than some of this other stuff too. So not an ideal solution necessarily, because I challenged myself to get as close to the original sound as possible. This is more or less where I fell down on that. But I did also challenge myself to finish this in less than a day, or maybe it was a full day. Either way, I'm super busy on this video game that I'm writing music for, so I didn't have a whole lot of time to spend on this. I'm also not getting paid. I just wanted to do this for fun. So yeah, I definitely had a time limit. That was the best solution I could come up with on short notice. The Yayli Tanbur. Now you'll notice that we didn't start at the very beginning of the Numenor track because that's just a Yayli Tanbur solo. And I have East-West Quantum Leap Raw's Yayli Tanbur, which is not a bad library. It sounds fine. It just doesn't have true legato. And true legato is basically when you play a note and then play another one overlapping, samples will trigger, transition samples will trigger between those two notes to make it sound a little more fluid and a little more realistic. That is absent in this one. I mean, I know this patch does technically say legato, but that's something of a misnomer. It's basically just a glorified sustain. So that's why I didn't start at the beginning, because I didn't think I would get a convincing sound from just that library. The ideal solution would have been to hire a Yayli Tanbur soloist, but I don't know any in Denver. It probably would have taken quite a while to find one, and I wouldn't have wanted to pay them nothing anyway, because I'm not getting paid for this. So, and again, the whole point of this was to specifically flex my mock-up muscles to see how realistic I could get it. So, but we did, the Yayli Tanbur is in this mock-up. It is doubling the horn line when the actual Numenor melody comes in. And the reason why this worked is because my brass samples are so good, and horns in and of themselves have such a round, full tone that it helps to cover this up a little bit, to cover up the fact that there's no legato on this library. You know, it takes your ears away from that when they're playing in unison. sounds pretty good. And while we're on the subject of horns, I got to give a shout out to Aaron Venture's Infinite Brass. This is the most amazing brass library I've ever used. Absolutely, hands down. Because it sounds just as good, if not better, as all the other ones that I've used, and it has like a fraction of the RAM footprint because it's a sample modeled library, right? So instead of loading in gigabytes and gigabytes of wave file recordings of players imbuing their performances with, shape or like if you play a C and you want a staccato, and then you play a C and you want legato, like there are different wave files for each of those, and it just takes up an enormous amount of RAM. This is not that way. It just takes basically more or less an initial sound and then modifies it sort of mathematically in a way that and manipulates it in a way that makes it sound realistic, but without having to load all of those sound files. You're just manipulating the same sound. Now, the drawback to this is that while it does save you a lot of resources, and it also makes it a lot easier to play. This is very playable. I was able to get this to sound really good with pretty minimal CC fiddling. The drawback, though, is that you do have to over-exaggerate those gestures sometimes, because when you're loading up actual performances of players that are saved as WAV files, you have the benefit of those players, again, automatically imbuing that performance with musicality that they're used to doing. Whereas here, if you don't do that, it's just, it sounds really, really fake, like really obviously so. So it becomes even more important to really exaggerate those. Like right here, where it leaps up a fourth. You see how steep that curve is? I do that to imbue it with some life, give it some soul. Even if you're going for like a jazz solo, this library is incredible. It's got all the mutes, and it's, again, really easy to shape the phrase in very sophisticated ways. And here, obviously, I'm using it as a section. These four horns are playing in unison. The only thing you have to worry about is make sure the humanize button is checked, and you're good to go. It sounds great. Now, one of the biggest challenges here is that I didn't have access to a chart. There's just no chart to be found. It's not released yet. Maybe never will be, which is one of the unfortunate things about, film and television scores. But here I have the choir, and you'll see the same sort of CC swells that I was talking about. You'll notice that each of the Midi notes is separated a little bit, as opposed to the strings, which is all very, very connected. The reason for that is that the choirs aren't just going ah or ooh. They definitely have lyrics. In fact, Bear's team went to great lengths to make sure that the lyrics made sense and followed Tolkien's rules. All of this is in Adonaic, the language of the Numenorians. And again, because I don't have access to what the lyrics actually are, I was forced to just rely on my ear and try and approximate the syllables that I was hearing. And this is the best that I could come up with. I am sure that this is wrong. It's definitely not what he wrote, but I feel like it's close enough to do the mock-up justice. And this, by the way, this library is phenomenal. This is East-West Hollywood choirs. You can get this to sound really realistic. And really quick note about syllables too. I was helped a lot in this regard, because even when a choir is singing by itself, and even when every singer is enunciating very clearly, which choral singers are trained to do, it's often kind of notoriously difficult to make out what they're saying. because they're generally in a reverby space, and there are a lot of them. There's the distance between you, and if you add on orchestra and a bunch of other stuff in the mix on top of that, it just gets even harder. So I think, I was able to kind of get away with fudging this a little bit because that's really how choir's supposed to sound. In fact, the rule is sort of an industry standard thing. When you're mixing choir and orchestra, you're supposed to put the choir way in the back of the mix. You're supposed to get it really washy, and so that it blends well and sort of gets rid of the weird transitions between syllables. And it's supposed to be a little bit just kind of in the background, present, but not, you can't always make out what they're saying sometimes, which is, it's trying to imitate reality in that way. So here, I call it the drop. I don't know why I do that. I've never written an EDM track in my life, but it's just so satisfying. I mean, this is the point at which the city of Numenor is fully revealed in all its glory, and the orchestra and choir and everything comes in 2D, and it's just magnificent. And I gotta say, I'm a sucker for counterpoint, which is at its core basically just one idea against another, but existing in, coexisting simultaneously. And that's what we've got here. We've got the horns with the original Numenor theme that we heard earlier with the Yayli Tanbur. They're plugging away at that, but simultaneously the choir is in triads with the initial, it's not really an ostinato, it's just kind of a repeated chord progression that Bear had set up with the men initially, except that both men and women are singing it now. And then the strings up here, there we go, are outlining the uppermost voice of that in octaves. And octaves are important. Little orchestration lesson here. If you've got choir and brass and everything just going full bore, your only prayer for strings cutting through that mess is to have them in octaves, not divisi them. You'll never hear them. And doing that is also grounded in physics, right? Because they're supporting each other's overtones and everything. But the other thing too is that the violin ones are really high on the E string, and that's important because the E string is very penetrating. That's why you hear a lot of soaring string melodies high on the violin E string in film music and whatnot. And I'm pretty sure I got this right because I definitely hear the violas 2 octaves below that here in the original track when the mix thins out. Maybe better than I should be able to hear them. It's because the original track was striped as opposed to all recorded in the same room. And you have to do that these days, right? Like, I'm not criticizing Bear for that or anything. It's just a part of the logistical nightmare of getting a score out the door. What else is there? Oh yeah, the woodwinds. The only time I heard traditional woodwinds in this track was at the very, very climax of this piece, where the violins do this spirited it's like a celebratory thing, and we get like the most impressive wide shots of the entire sequence. Piccolo is definitely the most noticeable of them, but I suspected there was a whole, wind section there. So that's what I put in. And my initial instinct was to bring the piccolo up just a little bit, but that's always the trap, right? Because piccolo is piercing. It'll cut through any ensemble when it's high enough. But it's not going to be in your face and annoying the way that it is, or the way that it can be if you mix it that way. So it's like, these are things you pick up if you're around orchestras a lot and either writing for them or just listening to them or playing in them, whatever it happens to be. Let's see. I don't want to get too into my mixing process, because what I basically do is just load up my orchestral template, which has the vast majority of my mixing done already. And even then, I would actually say most of the mixing is already done in a lot of these libraries. Aaron Venture Brass, Cinestrings, Cineperc. You don't have to do a lot with them to begin with because they're already mixed for you for this purpose, for you to make a convincing mock-up as close as you can out of the box. But every now and then, there's some EQ and compression that I have to do. But then I just save that to my template so that it rolls over into the next time I have to do this. And so yeah, generally the mixing process is very minimal for me. It mostly involves stuff like this, like gain, individual gain adjustments on the audio track itself after I've already printed the audio. As you can see, I had to do that fairly extensively with the horns. The strings weren't too bad. A little bit here and there. Sometimes you just, an articulation transition isn't quite as smooth as you want. You have to go back and record that. Or sometimes things are just end up too soft. You try to get the performances and the volumes of everything right from the get-go on the MIDI CC data, but that's not practical. I mean, you're gonna miss something by the time you're ready to bounce your audio, and there's no shame in that. You can always go back and redo it. Hilariously, the choir was basically just one and go. But yeah, and then my mastering chain is, because I'm a bit of a noob when it comes to mixing. Most of my expertise and chops are in the composing, orchestrating, arranging, and engraving, like part making territories. So I kind of rely on Ozone 9, which is nice. It's got, I just throw a maximizer on here, dynamics. The imager is just there to, let me know where there are issues that I need to fix as far as the stereo width. And I usually don't need to do any EQing on the mastering chain, because I don't imagine I'll ever release for, vinyl or anything like that. But yeah, generally I would say the only thing I've really had to do is make sure that a lot of low-end EQ was cut off, because there's always a lot of garbage there if you don't go looking for that. And then make sure that, all of your really loud stuff is compressed just slightly. Yeah, I mean, these samples sound so good out of the box that I don't end up mixing very much, which is kind of nice. Oh yeah, one other quick thing about the mixing. Earlier I was going on and on about the ensemble articulations patch, specifically in Cinestrings. The thing about that is that, man, maybe, again, I'm a little bit of a noob when it comes to mixing, but it seems to me that the stereo width of that patch is not quite as pronounced as when you're using the section patches. So whenever I use that, I just put in a small, which one is it? Ensemble articulations, there it is. I just put in a little bit of stereo widening just for that patch, not for anything else, because Dennis Sands was very particular about how everything fits in the mix with those libraries. It's just mixed expertly. It's just that one patch, which is far superior in certain circumstances, particularly in situations like this where you need it to be like butter. It's always going to sound better to do just that one patch rather than do it all by section. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Oh, and I forgot to talk about my reverb, which is very important. I have bus sends on literally everything in my mock-up, the choir, the orchestra, everything, to this reverb. It's Valhalla Vintage Verb. I love it. It's cheap, but it sounds great. Cheap as in monetarily, you know. It just all goes to the aux bus, 100% mix, and a 2-second delay. Sometimes I play with this a little bit if depending on whether the track is like actiony, it has a lot of staccato or not. I tend not to separate, like a lot of pros will separate reverb based on whether you're doing legato or staccato. I don't really do that. I try to make the whole thing sound as unified as possible, as though we're all in the same room. But sometimes it behooves me to change this based on the character of the cue. But in this case, 2 seconds was plenty. And, oh yes, one other thing I forgot. This is extremely subtle. So you might have to listen very carefully in order to discover this. But there is, in fact, a lot of like plucked instruments in the beginning groove before the strings and the brass and all that come in, or I guess just the brass. And because, I mean, it was evident to me even before I read it in Bear's blog that there was a lot of Middle Eastern influence in this track, which is actually kind of brilliant because in the original trilogy, the Lothlorien music also has a little bit of Middle Eastern flair, which that's kind of a neat connection because Numenor has a huge connection with the elves, with the Valar. So that's kind of nice. But also it helps just to differentiate the different civilizations in this world. It's great. Anyways, I decided that what I was hearing was kind of like a hammered dulcimer sound, but because it's Middle Eastern, I thought, well, Santoor, let's just do that. It's basically a hammered dulcimer, but from that region. So that's here. You can see it rolling down here in the Midi. But that wasn't quite all. There was a very, very subtle guitar, I think, in that track, probably played by Steve Bartek or someone like that. So what I did was I turned the chord option on in Renaissance, I think is the name of that library. Let me see if I can find it here. Hello, there you are. Yeah, this one here. And you can see by the MIDI, it is just chords because it's so sparse. It's so buried in the mix, I almost didn't hear it. So what I did, it also wasn't very warm and there wasn't a lot of low end that I could tell. It was just kind of there as you know, window dressing. So I really aggressively EQ'd the low end out of it, so that you just had the high end stuff coming through. This is getting into the really subtle stuff that were probably my accuracy is probably going down as we get closer to the subtle stuff, but I don't think so. I think it's probably a Santoor and a very subtle guitar in there. So that about does it. I had a lot of fun walking through this and a lot of fun mocking it up too. So much so that I am gonna do this again, both with the game music that I'm working on, which there's like over 8 hours of. It's not just mine, but I've definitely written a lot of music that I'd love to dig in deep with, like this. There's also a lot of music that isn't mine that I want to do this with. In particular, I recently bought this from Omni Music Publishing. It's one of my favorite scores of all time, and there is even some unreleased, unrecorded cues in here. So it'd be a fun exercise to mock those up just to see how they sounded. So In the meantime, I hope you enjoy, and happy writing.